Hello and welcome to Newsclick. All of you are undoubtedly aware of the 2G scam and the Joint Parliamentary Committee established to look into the allocation of licenses in spectrum. Last week, the draft report of the committee was leaked in the public domain. Its contents have been causing serious consternation in political circles, and the present session of Parliament has in fact been stalled. To discuss the matter and the political impasse India finds itself in, I am pleased to have with me the eminent journalist Paranjoy Guha Thakurta, as well as a member of the Delhi Science Forum, Prabir Purkayastha. Hi Paranjoy. Now, before we get to the draft report itself, could you please explain to us the need for the establishment of the JPC, given that the CAG report as well as the Supreme Court decision do concentrate on the 2G scam? So what is the JPC supposed to establish or prove?
After the Controller and Auditor General of India presented its report on the so-called 2G or second generation telecommunication spectrum scam, which really talked about how a scarce finite natural resource like telecom spectrum was misallocated and undervalued and allegedly given to a select few. After that, typically what happened is the Parliament's Public Accounts Committee deals with the reports of the CAG, and the government has to furnish a report which is called an action taken report on the basis of that particular to the Public Accounts Committee. Now, what happened simultaneously was there was a huge hue and cry over what happened. The CBI registered its cases. The Supreme Court of India directed the CBI to take firm action. Mr. Raja had to first resign a few days before this report was presented in Parliament, and it was leaked before it was presented. Thereafter, Mr. Raja was arrested and put behind bars, and he was in custody for about a year and a half. Meanwhile, the Supreme Court of India cancelled 122 of these licenses. But wait, take a step back. Even as all this was going on, the political opposition said we need a joint parliamentary committee. And in fact, an entire session of Parliament, the winter session of 2011, was virtually paralyzed because the government was not willing to concede to the demand of the opposition, both on the right and the left, the Bharatiya Janata Party and the Communists, to set up a joint parliamentary committee. Eventually, the government did concede. Then the JPC was set up. But now we have a different controversy, because the draft report that has been presented by the JPC, headed by Mr. PC Chacko, who happens to be a Congress member of Parliament, has not been found acceptable to the or a very substantial section of the members of this joint parliamentary committee, comprising members from different parties, who believe that this first draft report that has been presented and leaked is really what the Congress would like the world to know, because it focuses on the losses that took place earlier when the NDA and the BJP was in power. And this is the period before 2004, 1998, the terms of reference of the Joint Parliamentary Committee was pushed back to include this period. And the first draft of that report apparently seeks to give a clean chit to Prime Minister Dr. Manmohan Singh and Finance Minister Mr. Chidambaram for their alleged involvement in the scam.
Okay, Prabir, there has been a fair bit of commotion over the fact that the committee failed to call both the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister as witnesses to depose before the committee. Do you regard them as material witnesses? Do you think that they were important to be called to establish the truth over the matter?
Looking at the earlier question you had raised, why a JPC? Now, JPC is not involved with, say, what will happen to Mr. Raja, is criminality going to be proved or not. JPC was really to set up, to establish the political implications of such a major scam having taken place, and therefore looking at the collective responsibility of the cabinet, the major players, not only in criminal terms, which is what the courts would do, but in political terms. So in that sense, what is really the jurisdiction of the Parliament is policy. So why did policy fail? What are the checks and balances which did not take place? Now, if you look at all of that, now it's very clear that on spectrum, the Finance Minister's consent is required to set the spectrum price. That's a 2003 cabinet decision, and also based on what is normal cabinet functioning. If there's a disagreement on a revenue matter, then obviously it should go to either an EGOM or it should go to the cabinet. Were these things followed? What was the role of the Finance Minister? Did he give his consent, not give his consent? How did the cabinet accept that a minister can give LOIs and reach an agreement on revenue matters which concern not only his ministry but also the finance ministry, these are questions that needed to be answered in front of the JPC. Therefore, the finance minister needed to be called, and Mr. Raja has claimed that I kept both the finance minister and the prime minister informed of every step I took, and therefore if his contention is not right, then the prime minister also should have been called. And it's also clear, if you really look at it, that Mr. Raja gave a note, written notes to the JPC. He should have also been called, because after all, if he makes a certain claim which needs refutation, then all the parties should have been called, and I think that JPC failed in examining what were, to my mind, the three key material witnesses: Mr. Raja, Mr. Chidambaram and Dr.
So do you think this is sufficient ground then to vitiate the report in its entirety?
Well, I would say this certainly raises procedural questions regarding the JPC, but I would still say there is enough material on the ground. What it appears as from the newspaper reports that we have seen, what was deposed in front of the JPC to show that Raja's contention he kept the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister informed is not untrue, and there is again enough evidence to show that they had opposed at a certain point, not auctioning. They had opposed at certain point the way these things were being done. At some point, both of them have seemed to have acquiesced and treated this as if it's a fait accompli, and therefore allowed the licenses to be given at throwaway prices without saying that, okay, these were given, but it's a letter of intent, let's cancel them, and the government must then really, as cabinet, really examine what should be done. I think that is a really major lacuna which the JPC had enough on its record to show.
You know, I want to add a few points to what Prabir said. Sure. You know, firstly, when you look at a joint parliamentary committee, we've had several joint parliamentary committees in this country. There's at least one joint parliamentary committee, the one on the Bofors, with the opposition boycotted completely. But if you look at the track record of people who've been accused appearing before a joint parliamentary committee, we have the classic case of the late Harshad Mehta. He was facing a number of criminal cases, but he also appeared before the joint parliamentary committee. There are a number of instances of ministers appearing before a joint parliamentary committee, including Mr. Yashwant Sinha, who had appeared as a finance minister. If I recall correctly, that was the Ketan Parekh joint parliamentary committee. As for the Prime Minister appearing before the JPC, so far there's no precedent. But it's also significant to note that Prime Minister Dr. Manmohan Singh himself had offered to appear before the Public Accounts Committee to give his version of events, not the JPC.
Now, Paranjoy, you've briefly spoken about why the draft report is proving so controversial. But given that the JPC consists of so many different political parties, why is this issue only being raised now?
You have to remember that earlier, a draft report that was prepared by the Public Accounts Committee, headed by the BJP Member of Parliament, Dr. Murli Manohar Joshi, was rejected by a very, very thin majority, by in fact just a few votes, because there was no consensus on that particular report. Now, what has happened is that the political situation has undergone a change by the time Mr. Chacko presented his draft report. Firstly, what we have really is an all-party committee, but because two important constituents of the United Progressive Alliance coalition has broken away from the UPA, notably the Trinamool Congress and the DMK, that we find that the Congress no longer has a majority within the JPC unless the Samajwadi Party bails the government out or the ruling coalition out. So it's in a very, very dicey kind of a situation, and we'll really know what will happen once the subsequent meetings of the JPC take place. And my hunch is that there's going to be a huge hue and cry. Already there is evidence, and Shalini Singh has written about this in The Hindu, that the large proportions or large portions, I beg your pardon, of the draft report of the JPC appear to have been a sort of a verbatim copy of press notes that were put out by the UPA government and to justify what had happened.
Now, Prabir, this is also something you briefly touched upon previously, But the JPC report essentially places all responsibility for the 2G scam at the feet of Sri A. Raja, who was the Minister of Communications and Information Technology. Do you agree with the broad conclusion of the report in this regard?
Well, of course, none of us have seen the report. It's supposed to be secret, though it's been leaked, as we know, from various newspaper reports. Looking at the newspaper reports, I have to conclude that it does appear that Raja's guilt has been accepted by the Chacko draft report. Okay? I'm calling it the Chacko draft report because that's what it is at this stage. As far as the finance minister is concerned, it does appear from reports that the JPC draft report does concede that the finance minister finally acquiesced in Raja's action, even though this acquiescence was really post the LOI being given. But by fact that he did not object after the certain point, the finance minister stopped objecting to the DOT, and the fact that he gave his consent really after the LOI were placed, it does appear the JPC report or the draft report also concedes that there is a problem as far as the finance minister is concerned. So it doesn't appear the finance minister has got as much of a clean chit as it is appearing from the various reports or various things being said. It does appear that he has also been held partially accountable, though whatever finally the conclusions of the report are, I don't know. But what it appears from the sequence of events that we have heard, the Prime Minister, it appears, has been given a complete clean chit, and it's been stated that the report seems to say that he was misled, though I really don't see how it can be said, because again on public, what is publicly known and the deposition, the Prime Minister was fully aware. He had written letters, Raja had replied in his letters. Raja's replies very clearly state what he was going to do, and this is exactly what he did. So in what sense is the Prime Minister being misled? I'm not clear, when Raja is actually telling him what he's going to do, and this first come perverted, first come first served, if you will, principle that he followed, which really allowed people to jump the queue and do various things, which has again Supreme Court and others have dealt with in detail. So we're now going to deal with it here. So these issues were implicit in Raja's reply to the Prime Minister, which is again in public domain. So I really don't see how the JPC has given a clean chit saying that Raja misled the Prime Minister, because what we can say is that he led him on in exactly what he was going to do. So I really don't understand how the clean chit has been given. We can still say yes, he was not complicit in Raja's crime. It was basically consent to what was illegal activity. But I don't think you can really say that he didn't know anything. That seems to be going too far.
In fact, I wanted to add to, again, going purely by media reports and journalists, and there's obviously more than one journalist who's gone through the draft report. It's quite easy to leak a draft report when there are 30 copies of it in circulation, and it's even leaked to the National News Agency, which is the Press Trust of India. But going by the media reports, there are two or three things that are significant. One is the draft report seeks to trash the Controller and Auditor General of India, and clearly says that the CAG's report has sort of lowered India's prestige, so to say, in the Committee of Nations, because it's not just the biggest scam in India, but one of the biggest in the world, perhaps. So that's one interesting point that this draft report seeks to make. The other important point is that it is very, very critical of the NDA regime under Mr. Vajpayee, when over 40,000 crore rupees was lost when the government moved from a licensing system to a revenue sharing system. So it seems to have indicted the past government while giving the current government a clean chit. And I think the other important thing is, I think the government is truly being naive if it thought that it would get away by sort of heaping all the blame on one person and one disgraced minister. You have to remember that now the DMK is no longer part of the UPA. And Mr. Raja is not just screaming and shouting from the rooftops. He himself is making available those long letters that he's written to the JPC chairman, Mr. Chacko. And Mr. Chacko is saying that, okay, this is the draft report. Now, if you want to, you present a dissenting note. I really don't think this strategy is going to work too well, because at the end of the day, I see the government kind of tying itself in knots. And like the Banquo's ghost in Shakespeare's Macbeth, that ghost keeps coming back again and again to haunt the Macbeth, to Macbeth, and the kind of the guilt of the past, the misdemeanors of the past have this strange way of returning again and again to embarrass the present rulers.
Except you're not very clear who Macbeth is in this case.
I am presuming that there are more than one Macbeth. It could be the Prime Minister, it could be Mr. Chidambaram.
And who would be Lady Macbeth?
Now, Paranjoy, this is something you just briefly touched upon, so just to continue. Now, the JPC report is fairly scathing about the role played by the Comptroller and Auditor General and the presumptive loss figures presented by the auditor. Your thoughts on this issue? I mean, is this likely to lead to another showdown between the CAG and the government? We've seen quite a few in the recent past.
I don't know who's going to replace Mr. Vinod Rai as the Comptroller and Auditor General of India, but all those who've read the CAG's report, it's very clear. The CAG has never concealed the fact that these are presumptive calculations, these are notional losses. And it's not one set of figures, but 4 sets of figures based on 4 sets of assumptions. And I think the CAG has been very, very clear. I think the point that people are, that the Congress is truly embarrassed is all those zeros that have been added on. But the fact that things were not done in a transparent, fair manner, that the rules and regulations were subverted, that here was a scarce resource, a finite resource, a resource that is supposed to belong to the people of this country, that here was a government which was not a fair, transparent custodian of those resources. In a sense, it was bartering what belongs to the people in a way that was not just less than fair, but to help a privileged few, lot of people, thereby sort of causing a loss to a larger number of people. All the reasons given, that spectrum was given cheap to spread telephony, Mr. Raja wanted to break the back of an entrenched cartel, and that the government really didn't want to make money out of bartering this or allocating spectrum. These all seem to be sort of post facto rationalization and of trying to justify what is very, very difficult really to justify.
I think there's an important issue here. On one hand, they talk about giving spectrum free or at low cost to help spreading telecom. At the same time, they don't really focus on the fact that the mergers, acquisitions, etc., all those things were also relaxed in order essentially to help Swan and Unitech.
So the issue is basically, did the benefits reach the customer or not?
Did not really reach the consumers, that's being argued. So that part of it they don't touch. Did it really help the consumers benefit? And if a private auction instead of a public auction take place, which is what had really happened, how does it help the consumer? So this is one part of the argument. Second is, if they disagree with the undervaluation methodology, they could have proposed another methodology and said not this but this. So Vinod Rai and CAG proposed essentially a market-based mechanism, looked at what the market was offering, different kinds of things. And it's interesting, TRAI also in 2011 has also said virtually the same thing in the recommendation. So TRAI in 2010 also made various calculations, and one of them is basically what's called the econometric method, and did calculation to show the loss is about 36,000 crores if that is the method followed. But they also at the end of it said that basically we should really look at the market mechanism, and that was a 3G auction. And they have said the 3G auction and the benefit of the 3G auction as against the 2G auction is really not significant, and therefore we should really use that as a benchmark price. So I would still agree if they said the CAG methodology is wrong. So okay, it's wrong. Give us an alternate methodology, which is not being done. Instead of that, it is being said because the methodology we think is faulty, therefore undervaluation is not there, and we come back to what Mr. Sibbal used to argue, zero loss. Because the calculation is wrong, therefore there is no loss. Well, find a method of calculation. You cannot therefore say this methodology is wrong, therefore no loss.
And it's particularly interesting, and I should say paradoxical, that this very same government which is preaching the virtues of markets and free markets and economic liberalization and free enterprise capitalism should itself be so reluctant to look on the valuation of spectrum using the market or through a market mechanism. So the prices that were discovered in 2001 were presumed to have remained constant all the way up to 2008, though the market in this period had gone up sevenfold.
75 times. 4 million to 300 million subscribers is the mobile telephony numbers from 2001 to 2008.
So the drastic change in the telecommunication landscape
times,
was not accounted for. Prabir, do you see the JPC report as putting a full stop to this entire saga, to the entire 2G scam, in terms of assigning appropriate responsibility to the relevant political persons?
I think at the end of the day, political responsibilities will be assigned by the people. So JPC is only a mechanism, and this debate that takes place, the controversy that takes place, is in this sense an education of the people. And people will finally decide what is right, what is wrong, irrespective of who has the numbers in the JPC. The other part of it is, of course, criminality that has been committed, and that is for the courts to decide. So finally, at the bar of public opinion, I think Mr. Chacko's report is really destined for the dustbin, though it may appear that if the Samajwadi Party puts its 2 votes in favor of the Congress, then it's, I think, split 15-15, in which case Mr. Chacko's casting vote may still carry the day.
The whole issue is, will Mr. Chacko have that casting vote in the first place? That's a matter of speculation. But I do sincerely believe that it was not just disingenuous on the part of the government, but truly brazen on the part of the government, that it thought it could get away by presenting such a draft JPC report. And I do really believe whether I do really wonder whether Mr. Chacko was acting on his own or whether he was acting at the behest of his political masters.
You must also think about this. Too many lawyers in the government who believe that if you can argue in court anything, then you can also argue on the bar of public opinion anything, as long as you think you can fool the people. I think that is the problem that this government has.
This is the problem with lawyers, and lawyers turned politicians. They often also underestimate the capability of our judges and the honest judges in our midst to really see through attempts to obfuscate and attempts to cloud what are true, very, very issues which are actually very, very clear.
Well, that's all we have time for today. I'd like to thank Paranjoy and Prabir for joining us to discuss this matter, and thank you for joining us as well.